going on, everybody? It's your boy Gsluke here with our course breakdown for this week's BMW Championship. We've got ourselves a brand new venue here on the tour, Wilmington Country Club, one we've never seen before. So as a result, definitely some extra diving into the stats that are needed. Going to have to be a little bit more creative with our analysis this week, but that's why we're here. We've got you covered for everything you need to know, both from the DFS and the outright betting side. And coming out a little bit later than usual because yesterday I had a little bit of an unfortunate injury. I was golfing, tried to send a drive a little bit harder than I should, went with the one-handed Hideki finish and dislocated the good old left shoulder there. So had to get that checked out. No structural damage, no golf for a month, but hey, we'll recuperate, come on back, and get plenty of putting practice in the meantime. So that's what we were dealing with there, but hey, my issues aside, I'm really looking forward to this week. We've got ourselves what looks like a pristine golf course, one that should be a ball striking test, much like we saw at TPC Southwind. And I know through the first two rounds, that leaderboard wasn't really the best, but by the end, right, the top 5 to 10 was completely littered with guys there in the 10 and 9K range. John Rahm was in 5th. You had Colin Morikawa up there, and most deservingly, Will Zalatoris, who, what can you say about him now, as he was quoted there on 18, just a great breakthrough victory that I had an outright ticket for. Pretty much the entire community did as well. So coming in with some pretty good vibes here for the BMW and looking to run it back here for this week. So with that being said, excited to hop into it. Let's go ahead and cover this golf course. Wilmington Country Club, the South course specifically, is going to be where we're teeing it up this week, and it's a long par 71, 7,534 yards, which makes it one of the longest courses per capita that you were going to see year to year. Only Kiowa Island, which was a par 72, nearly 7,800 yards, was longer per stroke on the scorecard there. So in all senses, should be a bomber's fest, and on top of that, you're dealing with narrow fairways, so it's a Parkland-style golf course. They've got plenty of tree-lined fairways. Now, not all of them have a heavy tree line. Some of them are a little bit more sparse, but there's a few areas where if you're missing off the tee, you're going to be in a boatload of trouble. On top of that, it's in the Northeast, so in Delaware. You're dealing with a bluegrass rough, some patches of fescue that were added in over the last year or two. So if you're looking at an overhead view, make sure it's up to date, not something from 2 or 3 years ago, because they have added quite a few natural areas. And in general, massive greens, about 8,100 square foot per green. So you're looking at, if you're hitting the fairway and you're hitting the greens, which, the greens are large here, the fairways are not, you're going to be in business, probably not posting many bogeys to speak of. But if you're missing off the tee, that bluegrass can cause plenty of trouble. But those tree-lined fairways, those areas that are super dense out there, could cause a lot of big scores to come in, particularly because some of the water hazards is only foreign property are strategically placed. It's a golf course where I think off the tee play is going to reign supreme, a la something like a Quail Hollow Club. It's another golf course that's relatively long, has plenty of elevation changes like you see at this golf course. So even though it is 7,500 yards, almost every single tee shot is from an elevated area. So you're going to get an extra 5 to 10 yards off the tee. So a lot of that distance is a little bit misleading, I would say. It's actually going to play a little bit shorter than 7,500 yards, but it's that same story at Quail Hollow. And you still have tee shots that are going to play uphill, right? So for the holes that you're getting an advantage on, they're going to be a little bit longer. And a lot of the shorter holes that are closer to 380, 390 yards, as we'll show here when we go hole by hole here in a little bit, are also going to be longer because they're usually playing uphill. So it's a strategic golf course, one that Robert Trent Jones designed in the 1950s and has had plenty of renovations over the years. It had one in 2008, most recently in 2018 when I mentioned they put in some of that fescue grass. Over the last few years, a few areas around the golf course have also been converted to natural areas, so more swampy, plenty of waist high plus fescue out there where they have a few bird boxes, just protected areas that make this an Audubon certified golf course, which if you're not familiar with that, means that there's areas like the ones that I just mentioned that are completely untouched by man except for, to try and rehabilitate animals, try and give them food, that sort of thing. And if you hit into them, you're pretty much going to be dead. It's going to be waist high, just literal natural areas like you're in the middle of a swamp, which you saw at the Wells Fargo Championship. The last time we talked about an Audubon certified golf course was about 3 months ago over there in Maryland. And if you missed off the tee around that venue, especially because it rained that week, it caused plenty of problems. And that's what I want to harp on right here is the forecast for this week is wet. There's first off rain in the forecast today, also some rain for Wednesday and Thursday evening. And if this golf course is going to play like we saw the Wells Fargo Championship, it's a bluegrass rough, which is a lot less penal than the Bermuda grass that we saw around TPC Southwind, but a wet bent grass is more penal than what we saw at TPC Southwind. When you get a 4-inch rough like we're going to have this week, it is a 4-inch bluegrass / fescue, as I mentioned before. That is going to be unbelievably penal, particularly when the fairways here are 20 to 25 yards wide. And now they vary quite significantly, especially the ones that have dog legs. You're going to have much larger, the 25-yard wide landing areas. But if you're going to be aggressive off the tee on those holes, as we'll show here in a second, you're going to get down to 15 to 20-yard fairways from time to time, which are going to be extremely difficult to hit, meaning that wet rough is going to come into play for most of the field. So I can see a few people, at least around the industry, that are projecting for like a 20 to 25 under par winner. I would question that because first off, it's a long golf course, and based on the fairways that I'm looking at, it is going to be a dicey prospect at best to get it in the fairway over 60, maybe even 65% for some of these elite tier players, which I would imagine a winning score being closer to maybe like 15 to maybe 20 under par at the very best, rather than something like 20 to 25 under par like we've seen at the BMW Championship over the last 4 to 5 years. That's another argument that I've heard made, but the golf course travels around, right? Last year, it was over there at Caves Valley. Before that, you had Olympia Fields. It usually is in the Midwest towards Chicago or up here in the Northeast, like we're getting for this year, but there's a wide variety in the venues that we're getting here for the BMW Championship. So I don't know if I'd look into it too much. They are all set up by the Western Golf Association, which has a hand in setting up pins, selecting these golf courses, so on and so forth. But I do think we have to look at them individually, right? Course history is only really valuable when we're looking at it for a specific venue, rather than it just being event history. So that's what I'm looking at for this golf course. What we're going to do now is go hole by hole, give you an idea of some of the strategy in play, and really just a taste of what to expect. It's a new golf course, right? It's new for all of us here. Let's go ahead and take a peek at what this course has to offer. All right, now for a hole-by-hole breakdown. It's important to note that the usual routing here at the South Course is not going to be in play this week. It will be all 18 holes from the South Course, but in a slightly different order. So just going to go over that right now. I will also put a link in the description of this video to the GCSAA site where they put out fact sheets for all of the golf courses here on tour, and you can get the routing there too. So first off, the holes that they're playing, I'm going to name them in the holes that you're going to see in this breakdown. So in order, they go hole 10, 13, 14, 15. Then it goes to hole 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. So those will be the actual holes on the South Course. And then for the back nine, it's holes 1, 2, 3, and 4. So they're starting with the first 4 holes there for the quote-unquote back nine. And then they're going to 16, 17, 11, 12, and finishing on 18, which again is the final hole there for the South Course. So the routing a little bit different, but still going to be all 18 holes here in play that we talk through on this breakdown. So hole number 1 is 443 yards. This is not going to be the starting hole for the actual golf course, but it is relatively straightforward. One of the few holes on property that doesn't dogleg severely in either direction. It's just a soft dogleg from right to left. You can see that there's some trees in play on the left. There's a few in play on the right, but this is one of the holes where there's not that many to speak of. You can miss left and right, still have a clear shot at getting to the green. So for people that are playing this as their home course, the members here for the South Course aren't going to be dealing with that hard of a hole. You can see the hole that they're actually starting on, which is going to be, I believe, hole number 10, if my memory serves me correctly there, has a lot more trees in play. So it's going to be a little bit more interesting this week from the starting standpoint, but that's hole number 1 there. Hole 2 is 415 yards. It's a dogleg from right to left, so you can see exactly what I'm talking about when it comes to the shaping of these holes, which first off leads me to believe that this is a ball striker's golf course, more importantly a shot maker's golf course, somebody that can move the ball in both directions. So if you have a preferred ball flight, something from left to right or right to left, and you can only hit that shot exclusively, this might not be the best course fit for you. You want somebody that's a little bit more versatile, that can get it done in both directions, but in either circumstance, hole 2 requires a right to left ball flight. flight, try and shape something, because this landing area is not very large. This is about your average width fairway around this venue. It's right around 22 to 23 yards wide, which seems like more than enough room, but it's not all that much when you're dealing with a driver, right? You're going to be landing it in this fairway and perhaps bounding through into that rough. And like the weather report mentioned, it could be really wet in Wilmington throughout this week. That rough could be extremely penal there. So that's why driving accuracy, people that can get it out there both long and accurate, could be the guys to target this week. So when we get to the key stats, we see some of the other holes around this property that will become especially evident. Hole 3 is your first par 5. It is 630 yards, so an absolute brute of a golf hole, and going to be a 3-shotter for most of the field. And I say most because you might have a few guys that take a crack at it. You can see the Pro Visualizer has your tee shot at just 300 yards. Now, this is a hole where it does slope from, right here down to this little valley here, and per the site, there is a quote-unquote speed slot that people can hit here in the fairway. Now, if it's going to be extremely damp, you're not going to get that kind of rollout, but let's assume that it's dry enough for that speed slot to pay off. You could potentially see guys that hit it down here like 360. I have it at 358 right there. That leaves you at right around 260 to the green over a lake. So it's a risk-reward situation if I've ever seen one. I would imagine that most players lay up, get it down here to right around a 100-yard wedge shot, and try and make birdie that way. It should be a birdie hole for at least a third, maybe even half the field if you get a simple pin location. But like I mentioned, if it's slightly drier than at least it looks right now, maybe you get that speed slot. Somebody like a Scheffler, a Rory McIlroy, a bomber goes out there and is able to reach into, but it should be a 3-shotter for at least the vast majority of the field. Hole 4 is a par 3. You do have water the whole way down the left, and it is playing downhill, so you can't really see it here, but it is going to be playing downhill here, and it's a difficult shot. The entire green slopes from back right to front left per the PGA Tour site there, which means any pin location here in the back left, if you have too much backspin, it's only 170 yards downwind, you could be dealing with a little bit of a tricky situation there. It also slopes from right to left the whole way to the back of the green, so any location on that left side there is going to be extremely difficult. Expect a lot of players to bail out to the right, except the issue is this is all rough over here except for the front right. If you end up in this little spot here, you're probably going to be okay because you can apply spin, but because of the slope, getting up and down in this rough or even in the bunker over there is a tough task, right? With all that slope, you're not going to be able to stop the ball very easily. So even a right side pin location, which you'll see probably there on Thursday or Friday, could still be relatively hard. Hole 5 is 469 yards. It is relatively straightforward, at least for your tee shot. There's not that much in play. There is the one fairway bunker there, but they get you on the second shot, right? There's always going to be give and takes around, or I should say, risk-reward situations around this golf course because, hit the fairway here, right? Get your job done. You could even hit a 3-wood down here. It is a relatively large fairway. The farther back you lay up, it does leave a slightly longer shot into the green, which, again, creates another problem, right? Because if you lay back here to 180 yards, it's an 180-yard approach shot over a lake. In a lot of the pin locations, I would imagine should be close here to the left side of the lake. Imagine there's a front pin location. There should be a back left pin location. Hell, even for all 4 days, they might hug that left side, which means that if you're a little bit more aggressive off the tee, like you press a little bit down here, right? Get it down here to the valley like you saw the first marker. You're going to have, 140, 150 yards in. Players are going to be a lot more comfortable hitting that yardage over water than something like 180 yards. I'd expect a lot of players in that 180 range to bail out to the right, end up in one of these greenside bunkers, which with the undulation from back right to front left, that's something that you see on a lot of the greens around this property, is going to make getting up and down a dicey proposition. So this is certainly not a gettable hole. It looks relatively straightforward off the tee, right? It's just like, lay up to that one spot there, except if you miss the fairway pushing it down here, and that's the other situation I wanted to mention, right? Like, you're gonna have no problem hitting the fairway back there, right? I don't want to call it a gimme fairway, but it's like 30 yards wide. You're going to be hitting like an iron off the tee at the most to get to that point. Hitting the fairway down here is no simple proposition, right? It's like 20 yards wide at the very most. It's what you're used to seeing around this property. You end up in this bluegrass rough, and it's a little bit wet there. You're going to see a ton of water balls. And over there on the left, you're going to get your ball, your club, I should say, that catches there, ends up turning over in the rough, and, rather than hitting the straight ball high onto the front part of the green, it's going to turn over left into the lake. Hole 6 is 390 yards. It is one of the shorter holes on property. It does play slightly uphill, so like I mentioned, you're going to be playing uphill most of the time on these shorter holes, which makes reaching this in one completely impossible. You're not going to see anybody bombing up their green side, but hit this fairway, which is relatively narrow, you're going to have a wedge at most in. It is a slightly blind shot because it is a solid 11 yards uphill, but should be a birdie opportunity for most of the field. Hole 7 is the second par 3 on the front nine. It is 205 yards, and this is the largest green on the entire property. It is nearly 11,000 square foot. Arnold Palmer was quoted as saying he could land his airplane on it. You have 3 bunkers there at the front of the green, so you can't really run anything up. But it does play 6 meters or 6 yards downhill. So it should be something that you can hold the green on, right? It's going to be like a 7-8 iron for most of these players. So it is a relatively easy hole because of how large the green is. You're not going to have any problem hitting the surface off the tee with at least a solid tee shot. But 2-putting, 3-putting could be relatively common around that track. Hole 8 is 487 yards, so hole 8 and 9, I believe both of them are some of the longer par 4s on property. This one is a dogleg from left to right, so not every dogleg is going to be from right to left. You're going to have that left to right ball shape too. You got some fairway bunkers that come into play, a huge green, so similar to hole number 7 there, one of the larger greens on property. And you can see the pictures here are actually from the renovation that I was talking about a few years ago. So you can see even the Pro Visualizer tool here isn't completely up to date with some of the overhead images. It is the best one I've seen though. It's a large green surface like I was mentioning before, but you got to hit the fairway, right? It's 487 yards. You got to be in the short stuff to have a decent look at birdie. Hole 9's another long par 4. This one's 498 yards, so even longer than what we saw for last hole. There are a ton of fairway bunkers in play, 3 down the right, 1 on the left. It is a straightforward tee shot, so not doglegging in one direction or the other. But it is a hard fairway to hit in a long hole. And a lot of these yardages, I guess I should have mentioned it at the beginning, this is for the 7,300 yard setup. It's playing over 7,500 yards now. That means that on average, it's at least a 10 to if not a 15 yard difference on most of the holes out here. So some of the par 3s going to be playing a little bit longer, but more importantly, a lot of these par 4s have had a lot of distance added. Now the par 5s are pretty much maxed out, but the par 4s are going to be even lengthier than what you see here on this preview. Hole number 10 is, I believe, what they're using as hole number 1 here. It's dogleg from, actually, I don't think it is actually. Hole number 1, we'll have to see it. I don't think it's hole number 10, though, because I believe it was a dogleg from right to left. Might be wrong, though. Either way, right? We talked about it there at the beginning. You can go ahead and double check that. But it's a dogleg from left to right. You're going to have that fade shape for a righty. You're going to see a lot of players hit it through the fairway here into this fairway bunker. It is an odd-shaped green. You can see it's like almost like an 8 or a little bit of an hourglass shape there with the bottom half being a little bit larger than the top, but 4 greenside bunkers. A lot of the pin locations are going to be tucked, up there in corners like the back left. I'd imagine a front right pin location, maybe even a middle left pin where you have both of these fairway greenside bunkers in play. Could be a little bit tricky. Hole 11 is a straight up par 4. It's also relatively short. This one, you might see a few balls near the green. So that one that was 390 yards, it plays uphill. You're not going to see many sniff the green. But guys like Rory McIlroy, Keith Mitchell, those bomber type of players could take a crack at this one because there is a speed slot there. At the very least, you're going to see some players that get it up here near the green, in that flip wedge range. 313 yards gets you pretty damn close. So let's assume that you're a bomber. You can hit it at least 320 yards, 330, maybe with the rollout, right? You're on the front edge at that point. So this one's a little bit more gettable in 2, but still a priority on hitting a good tee shot to set up that birdie look. Hole 12 is 409 yards, so another shorter par 4. This is why they're using this side to start, right? It's the easier holes on the golf course. So you want to give these players a little bit more of a digestible start rather than killing them there with hole number 1 we looked at, which was pretty difficult. But this is a large fairway, at least for this golf course. The farther down you hit it, the more of a ribbon it becomes. But if you're hitting a 3-wood or even an iron off the tee like you might be back here, you have a solid 30-yard landing area. It's right around like 25 yards all the way up to the choke point where you hit driver. Now, if you're a super long player, like a Rory McIlroy, Keith Mitchell, for example, right, you're hitting it into an absolute ribbon. So that's why I mentioned earlier that off the tee, I think might be a little bit more important this week, because if you're an elite level driver, you can take on a lot of these doglegs and just take it over the side, which I'll show you on a few of the holes here in a second, and set up flip wedges into greens. Whereas a lot of the field, the guys that aren't bombers, they're going to take a lot more conservative approach. I'd imagine a lot of them lay up back here. The shot that Pro Visualizer had in here initially, where it's 270 off the tee, you have like 140 yards in, that is still a scoreable hole, right? It's still going to be one of the easier holes on property, but it's not like a flip wedge, right? Where you're trying to make birdie 50% plus of the time. That's why I think off the tee play might be super important here. And I haven't heard a lot of people talk about it this week. Hole 13 is 208 yards. It's actually one of the smaller greens on property, which might be surprising for a par 3 of its length, but it's a lot longer than it is wide. So you're going to get pin locations in the back left, back right, front left, front right, just all the difficult spots that you can think of that bring a lot of these bunkers into play that, really test the limits of how narrow this green is. So hole 13, I'd expect to play difficult. Hole 14 is 532 yards. It's a severe dogleg from left to right, and this is where the distance factor comes in. So this is the dogleg thing I was talking about. 270 gets you to this dogleg, right? It gets you to the end of the L, right? You're going to have guys that just bomb it, like absolutely nuke the thing out here. Let's see. This is only 313 yards, right? You hit it 313, you have 160 in. Let's see. Rory McIlroy, right? He can get out there like 330 on the fly, right? Let's see. That leaves you 130 yards into this green. And you're going to tell me that distance and off the tee doesn't matter here with the drivable par 4 that only the elite bombers can get to, a par 5 that you can put a pitching wedge or even, a degreed wedge in hand in. Yeah, right. It's going to be a huge factor around this golf course, especially if it's wet and it's playing longer and this rough gets a little bit more gnarly, right? It's going to be all about total driving, not only hitting it a long way, but also hitting a lot of fairways. It just screams Rory McIlroy to me, by the way. So we'll go to hole 15 here. It's 399 yards. It's a straightforward par 4, so you don't really have a severe dogleg on this one. Again, you can probably count them on one hand, the straightforward par 4s here. It's a relatively large green, so after, a little bit of a unique hole where you have the severe dogleg there, this one's a little bit more typical. Hole 16 is 614 yards, so it's one of the longer par 5s on property. This one, most players are probably going to reach it in 3. You can see the landing area for a 3-wood is large, right? You have this little outcropping the whole way out here to the right, which will help out some players. I'd expect most to hit driver here, though, right? Try and take it past these fairway bunkers. If you're going to hit it like, that's 360. That's a little bit aggressive, right? Let's tone it back here a little bit, like 320, 315. You're definitely bringing the fairway bunkers into play, but you're going to leave yourself with just about, 300 yards in still. It's going to be a tough proposition, especially when you consider that it is well protected. You have this bunker here over to the right, actually 2 of them, a little bit hard to see there with the tree. On the left side, another fairway bunker. This should be a 3-shot hole for most of the field, except somebody like a Keith Mitchell, except somebody like a Rory McIlroy that has the ability to go out there and hit it a long way. It does play slightly downhill, right? So maybe subtract 5-10 yards from both of those shots, but unless you're an elite level distance player, I'd expect it to be hard to get there in 2. Hole 17 is the longest par 3 on property. In fact, it's the hardest hole on property. You're playing over water. It is a large green. You're playing a little bit downhill too. A lot of times it's playing downwind from what I hear. This is not an easy hole to hold the green. It does slope from back right to front left, like a lot of the greens on property, as we mentioned a few times here now, which brings this water even more into play, right? If you hit a drawing shot to a left-hand location and it's running a little bit with too much side spin, you can end up going into the lake that way too, let alone if you mishit it and end up in the lake on the fly. Hole 18 will be the finishing hole. It is a dogleg from right to left. This water is not in play on this hole. It's more in play for that hole there. But it is tricky. You have these fairway bunkers, which are certainly going to catch a few players. The one to the right will catch people that are going through the fairway, maybe bailing out a little bit. If you end up overtaking a draw, overcooking it, that sort of thing, you're going to end up in one of these fairway bunkers to the left. You really want to get out there, get it in the fairway. I'd expect some players to maybe even hit a 3-wood to do so, something closer to like 280 yards, which leaves you an uphill shot right around 170, 180 yards in. So it's not an easy proposition. You have a ton of rough around it, no chipping areas that are fairway. You have the front left bunker, front right bunker. Just it's a good finishing hole. It's not going to be a brute, something that plays a ton over par, but still a hole where you have to execute a shot both off the tee and into a relatively protected green. Now that we've seen the golf course, let's talk about some of the stats I'll be using this week to identify my top plays. At number 1, we have shots gained off the tee. You probably figured that from the hole-by-hole analysis, but plenty of dog legs that can be chewed off. And it's not about just hitting it a long way, it's also about hitting the fairway. I expect this rough to be a little bit more gnarly than those expect, and for getting the ball in the short stuff to be a huge advantage. So whether you're a long player or somebody that does it with their accuracy, I want to see you gaining to the field. That's really something that I haven't seen a lot talk about, right? I'm going to comp this to a lot of other courses that are also driver heavy, so it's not a surprise that I'm looking at guys like a Scotty Scheffler, a Rory McIlroy, that do it both with their distance and their accuracy. In terms of some of the middle tier guys, let's think of a Keith Mitchell, right? A lot of times when Rory McIlroy plays well, like at the Wells Fargo Championship at Quail Hollow, you have Keith Mitchell at the top of the leaderboard too, and it's not just that event. You've seen that same type of crossover from event to event. I mean, courses where Bryson DeChambeau and Matthew Wolff used to have a lot of success together. Also, those same type of tracks. And what do they have in common? A lot of dog legs, a lot of risk and reward when it comes to that driving distance, and also relatively gnarly rough, right? Clubhead speed is a huge factor of getting out of rough when it's over that 3.5 inch mark, like you're going to see this week with this 4-inch bluegrass. So for me, shots gained off the tee is a way to encapsulate all of those effects, whether it's taking home some of those risk reward holes, taking that gnarly rough out of play, something that I'm using as a key differentiator. Now, number 2, we have shots gained putting, specifically on the bent grass surface. I glossed over it a little bit before, but we do have the bent grass surface here, which tends to not be as grainy. It's a little bit more straightforward than most tracks. So the putting stats that we saw at TPC Southwind, I wouldn't look into them all too much. Bermuda grass is unique. You get those grainy, hard to read surfaces, at least for players that aren't used to it. Now, for somebody like me that's used to Bermuda, right, I'm licking my chops when I'm playing a Bermuda course. It makes reading greens easy for somebody that can just look at the color of the green and figure it out. But for people that aren't used to that, it's befuddling, right? The color differences don't really help them all that much in figuring out the reads. So last week, I'm putting those stats aside and really just trying to harp on the guys that have putted well on bent, because for the last 2 to 3 months, outside of TPC Southwind, we've been on bent, or at least a combination of bent grass and Poa Anua. So as a result, looking at some of the putting stats over the last 18 to 20 rounds on bent, it should be relatively fruitful. From everything I've heard on property, these greens are pristine, they run pure, they look kind of similar to St. George's, which we saw a little bit ago, and even what we've seen over the last few weeks, just very pure surfaces, which isn't a surprise for what we're seeing here for the PGA Tour. And at number 3, we have shots gained approach. I'm looking at approach stats, which you're always going to see here in the top 3 week to week, but maybe a little bit less this week than what we're used to seeing. So don't get me wrong, it's a key stat. It's going to be something that we're using quite a bit. In fact, right, number 3 in our model, but a lot less than most weeks. The reason for that is we have massive aircraft carrier size greens. I mean, 8,100 square foot. Are you kidding me? Those are almost twice as large as what we saw at TPC Southwind. So hitting greens in regulation is going to be a lot easier around this venue, at least if you're hitting the fairway. So I'm really more looking at off the tee than anything, because setting yourself up with a good look into the green is going to be a lot more difficult than hitting the green itself. And to get the ball close to 5 to 10 feet, to take this place to 20, 25 under par, if you're one of the people that thinks it's going to be that easy, I don't, right? I think it's going to be like 15 to 20 under par, then you better be hitting fairways to set those up. So that's why I'm struggling to get to approach play as my number 1 key stat, because you have just such large landing areas. And of course, right, hitting it close matters. That's how you actually score birdies and whatnot, but you're going to be able to keep yourself in play if you're at least hitting that surface and are able to get down in 2. A few other key stats I'm considering. I'm looking at par 5 scoring just because of how long the par 5s are. The reason for that is when we're looking at par 5 scoring, there's 2 ways to get it done, right? There's the wedge fest way, where you're going up there and you're hitting solid at 100-yard wedges, or there's the distance factor, right? Justin Thomas, Rory McIlroy, Scotty Scheffler for that matter. All of those players are not only long off the tee, but they're top 5, top 10 in par 5 scoring. But you know who else is top 5 or top 10 in par 5 scoring? Guys like a Cam Smith. And sure, Cam Smith is relatively long off the tee, but the reason why he's so good at scoring on par 5s is his wedge play, his around the green play, right? He can put himself up near the green and then get up and down for birdie all day. So there's multiple ways to get that done. I think that's a really good way to try and encapsulate that effect. I'm also looking at shots gained at comp courses, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. Shots gained at Quail Hollow is going to be like the number 1 that I'm looking at. So it's actually an extra category I have in my model just for Quail Hollow itself. On top of that, we're looking at a few stats with bent grass, so shots gained out of bluegrass rough. I'm looking at shots gained on bent grass specifically over the last 24 measured rounds. So on top of just looking at a baseline, I'm also trying to hunker down on the last 24 rounds specifically. With some of the approach buckets, I am looking at shots gained approach out of bent grass rough. I'm looking at shots gained approach from the 150 to 175 yard range, a little bit more this week than most. That 175 to 200 yard range is also going to be a little bit more overutilized than we'd see on most weeks, and also that 200 plus yard range. A lot of the distance here with this golf course isn't so present off the tee. There's a lot of forced layups, as I showed you there with the hole by hole breakdown. So looking at some of the longer iron ranges should be extremely fruitful this week. And in terms of comps, at number one, I already talked about it. It's Quail Hollow Club. And really, I think it's the best comp by far. There's plenty of elevation changes around that property. I've been there on person, walked around the property, and from all of the overhead views I've seen of Wilmington Country Club, it gives me eerily similar vibes. The tree-lined fairways are present at both venues. Now, they're a little bit closer to the fairway there at Quail Hollow than what you see this week, but they're still just as dense at certain locations. There's plenty of carries over water. The par threes are very similar both from the visual and the strategy perspective. And at Quail Hollow, you don't have these aircraft carrier size greens. They're not 8,100 square foot, but they're still relatively large. They're not 4,300 square foot like you get at a TPC Southwind. So there's plenty of comps that I like to be made there. There's the visual perspective. There's also the strategy perspective with plenty of the dog legging fairways. And from a skill set perspective, right, you're looking for off the tee guys there. You're looking for guys that can putt on those surfaces. I can go out there and hit long irons a good way. And that's really what I'm looking at this week. So I like all of those as comps. Another course up there in the Northeast, I guess Southeast, right? It's not really Northeastern course there at the Wells Fargo, but you get the point. It's on the Atlantic side of things. Next up, we've got St. George's Country Club, which is the home of this year's RBC Canadian Open. It's a bent grass course. It's a lot shorter than what we're going to get this week. But what I really like here is the off the tee look. You had plenty of tree-lined fairways there. It was narrow targets too, right around like 20 yards wide, so even narrower than what we're going to see this week. But at that golf course, I didn't expect this, right? It was a brand new course for us. It played driver heavy, right? Just like I expected this course to play. A lot of that was due to the rough. It was damp there. It played a little bit longer because of some of the rain they got. And if the forecast holds up at this point, we're going to get a similar type of week where driving distance is going to be hampered. It's going to be all about hitting fairways and hitting it a long way. So I like the skill set fit there. And I also like the agronomy. Similar agronomy types at both golf courses, which is also extremely helpful from that perspective. And lastly, the last comp we'll talk about here is going to be TPC Potomac. So the home of this year's Wells Fargo Championship. So Quail Hollow, the home of the Wells Fargo from most years, but this year specifically, TPC Potomac, short golf course over there in Maryland, par 70 or 71, one of the two. But most importantly, the agronomy, the same. So, another golf course that checks that perspective, but it had that 4-inch bluegrass rough, plenty of fescue in natural areas. It's an Audubon certified golf course, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, where you can miss off the tee, but you got to miss in the right spot, right? If you end up in one of those fescue patches, if you end up in a dense forest, you're going to be in a heap of trouble. So off the tee there mattered. You had Roy McIlroy in contention. Max Homa, eventual champion, was a great ball striker, was immaculate off the tee that week. I'm looking for similar players. And the best part is we have a sample size from this year at TPC Potomac. I've heard a few people around the industry throwing out comps from courses we haven't seen for like 5-6 years. That really doesn't matter at the end of the day, right? We can't pull stats from those golf courses. St. George's, we had shots gained from this year. Obviously, have the TPC Potomac stats. In Wells Fargo Championship, we have shots gained metrics for the last 6 to 7 years. So that's the type of stuff I like to look at. And the reason why Quail Hollow can kind of get its own category in the model, right? I'm not just looking at quote-unquote comp courses, is we have a sustained sample size, right? Like 6 to 7 events there. And I think it's a almost perfect comp, right? Visually, both from the strategic perspective too, the skill sets that we're looking for, that I can put the most hype into that one, especially compared to St. George's, also TPC Potomac, right, where we have a 1-year sample size. And even less so, right, am I looking at other Robert Trent Jones designs, for example, which we haven't seen for like 5-6 years on tour. Now, there's a few that we play that I think we can pull stats from, but I wouldn't be looking at things like Firestone, for example, or the Quicken Loans National, right, that we saw back in 2015 that we literally have no stats to pull from. So that's what I'm looking at here. It's no exact science. Again, we haven't seen this golf course in action before, so there's plenty of speculation there, or at least speculation that has to be made on our end. But that's what I'm looking at, especially when I look at some of the other golf courses that have similar metrics to what we're going to have here at Wilmington and how I expect it to play this week. All right, fellas, that's all I've got for the course breakdown. Before you hop on out of here, go ahead and smash that like button. Also, go ahead and let me know what you think the winning score is going to be down in the comments. I'm going to take 19 under par. I expect it to be relatively gettable, large greens, but that off the tee test to perhaps bite a few people, right? Somebody could take this place low. I could see maybe the winning score being like minus 24 if that's somebody winning by like 4 or 5 strokes. But if we're talking about a competitive down the stretch type of affair, probably something closer to 19 under. But go ahead and let me know what you're thinking down in the comments. And as per usual, expect a full slate of content. I'm dealing with the shoulder injury, obviously. That was the delay here, but we're all good to go now. So DFS core picks will be dropping a little bit later on this evening. We'll have value picks, our weekly live stream at 7 p.m. on Wednesday. Everything you're used to expecting here on the channel. So looking forward to it, guys. It's playoff time, baby. We've got a lot on the line. Top 30 make it into all of the majors next year. We obviously have the top 30 playing it up at Eastlake, playing for an $18 million first prize. And I'll be there in person. I'll be over there in Atlanta watching all of the rounds for the Tour Championship. So I'm excited for that. If you're going to be there in person, hey, stop on by and say hi. I'll be able to be there on the course. But until then, guys, best of luck with all of your bets, all of your DFS lineups for this week, and let's get this cash.